Hey, my name's Chris Bentley, and along with my colleague Hirsch Perlis, we welcome you to the Legal Gold Rush series, where we encourage you to think differently so you can get your share of a $1 trillion legal market, most of which is out there for anybody who wants to go after it. We've been hosting a number of these sessions, and if you wish to go back to a previous session or our earlier series that commenced just after the COVID lockdowns began, go to our Legal Innovation Zone website. They'll all be there, and they're all free, as is virtually everything that we do. At the Legal Innovation Zone, our goal is to help build better legal solutions for consumers and to encourage the entrepreneurial spirit in all of us to get there, meeting the needs of consumers and providing a market for yourselves, for your company, for your firm, for other entrepreneurs. We are delighted today to host a very special friend, somebody we met before we formally opened the Legal Innovation Zone, whose journey we have watched from the beginning in admiration and wonder. I am going to let Hirsch Perlis introduce our special guest in just 2 seconds. A couple of administrative matters. We're all online. If there are a few tech issues, we'll deal with them. If you have a question, use the chat function. Hirsch will be able to see them and he can ask the question of our guest. The session will go for an hour. This is the last in our series. If you have any follow-up questions, comments about our series, about what we do, feel free to let us know. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hirsch Perlis, and thank you for joining us. And Hirsch, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it is my great honor to today be able to have a conversation with a very good friend of ours, Andrew Arruda. For those of you that do not know Andrew, Andrew is an entrepreneur and a lawyer. He is the CEO and co-founder of Ross Intelligence, probably the earliest, best-known AI company in the legal tech world. He speaks on AI, legal tech, A to J, and entrepreneurship. More recently, he was the subcommittee chair for the State Bar of California Task Force on Access through Innovation of Legal Services. He's been very involved in a number of universities, including the University of Saskatchewan, and really has been featured all over the world in various different magazines, newspapers, and has a very well-known TED Talk as well. So I think we are in for a great hour-long conversation. And really, I think we'll cover a lot of different areas: AI, entrepreneurship, A to J, regulations, data, probably get into a little bit of COVID and other areas. So I'm very excited to have Andrew here today. So Andrew, for those of you that, for those people that aren't as familiar with you, you were a young lawyer. You are a first-generation Canadian, and yes. I think after drinking with a buddy one night, decided to start up this AI tech company when no one was doing that type of stuff. How did you fall into this?
Yeah, well, you know, it's funny because a lot of the things that you said really kind of when it comes to me being a first-generation Canadian, I think that was super informative of my journey, because what had happened was, and Hirsch, I know that we've chatted about this before, growing up as a first-generation Canadian, first-generation immigrant, I was told, Andrew, by the most supportive parents and grandparents and family, you know, you can be anything you want, as long as it's a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And so in many ways, that was a really great thing, because what it did was, growing up, I really was fascinated by technology. I think I was always very entrepreneurial. You know, I was the kind of kid who would set up a lemonade stand, or I would sell, you know, soda, you know, in a stand, and pop in a stand, and just, you know, outside the door on hot days. And so that was always in me. And then I remember really what changed my life is when the internet started coming out, and there was a local public library nearby my house, and I would walk there, and you can sign up for the computer that had access to the internet for 30-minute slots at a time. And if someone didn't sign up after you, in the slot after you, after 5 minutes, you could get that slot too. And so I would sign up in the morning, and I'd get one slot, and I would wait there. And as soon as 5 minutes passed, I would, you know, tell the librarian, you know, there's 5 minutes, I can get that other slot. And I remember sitting down in front of those computers And I grew up extremely kind of blue collar, modest means. And there was, but on the internet, I was able to just access all this information, and the world opened up. And I was like, this is incredible. And I wish, and I want to do something at the intersection of technology. Then I pursued law, which was wonderful. And I started working at a local neighborhood law firm in Toronto. And I just started seeing a lot of some of the things that I thought could, really benefit from technology. And then I got really lucky. One day, a friend of mine introduced me to a computer scientist, and he was studying machine learning, natural language processing at the University of Toronto. And he was like, hey, Andrew, his name's Jimo Viagle, and Jimo really came up with the idea for Ross in the sense that he said, hey, what do you think about ML, NLP for legal research? I heard that, Hirsch, and I said to myself, this is the joining of all the things that I want to do. Because at the end of the day, what we had also decided, which has really been part of our DNA, is that, hey, if we do this, let's provide it for free to any legal aid group, any group doing pro bono work, and anyone pushing and improving access to justice. So all of my passions kind of melded into one. And that was about, I guess, over 5 years ago now. And it has been just so wonderful to see that decision flourish into a company that is helping, thousands of folks and really helping push the needle on A to J as well.
That's great. You just mentioned A to J, so I'm going to jump in there. The Legal Gold Rush, we really started this to talk about the unmet legal market, and we see it as like a $1 trillion market that no one goes through. And as you know, Ryerson just started a law school, and I can't tell you, for the past many years, so many lawyers would come out to me and say, why in the world does this country, this world need another lawyer? There are so many lawyers. But at the same time, if you look at almost any area of the law, you see 40 to 90% of people are going unrepresented. Like, why do you think that is? Why are there so many lawyers? There's so many legal service firms out there, but the vast majority of individuals and even corporations are going unrepresented?
Yeah, I think it's an issue of scale, and I think it's an issue that stems from a lot of things. It's a multi-headed beast. So to simplify it into one or two sentences, I think is impossible. But one of the things, and I can speak to my path as a legal tech entrepreneur. My original path, as I mentioned, was, hey, we're going to build this wonderful piece of technology that's going to just solve a big part of access to justice. And then, Hirsch, what happened was, along our journey, Jimo and I and the team realized that a lot of that was a bit naive as well, that's one thing. Technology can help with that. But what I became obsessed about was the regulations in place around the delivery of legal services, chiefly that you need to have a JD, full JD, to do so. Also, just the culture in law as well. I think there's a lot of challenges when it comes to truly servicing 100% of legal needs. I think, why would we need more lawyers? Actually, there's a shortage. It's a matter of not every legal matter is a high-end corporate matter that you should charge hundreds of dollars an hour for. And I think I've been really pushing this idea that the delivery of legal services needs to be multi-tiered. It needs to be regulated, not unregulated. I always say re-regulation is needed. And what we need to do is re-examine, where does it make sense for a lawyer, a fully licensed JD, to deliver a piece of that legal service kind of puzzle, and where might it make sense for other professionals who are certified, who are regulated, to also be part of that process. And Hirsch, I can't help but look to, and I think there are a lot of challenges still, but if you think of walking into a hospital or to the doctor's office or to a dentist's office, let's use a dentist's office. The dentist, isn't the person who's greeting you up front, taking and telling you, hey, there's the rack for your jacket, what's your name, and typing in your information. And then you have someone at the front, you have a dental hygienist, and then the dentist comes in when and where appropriate. And I think we need to look at that. I think the other example I use is, taking blood pressure. A doctor's not taking generally your vitals up front. A lot of the time that's done by a nurse practitioner. And so to have a highly qualified brain surgeon take your blood pressure and then charging for that just doesn't make sense. And the result of that is a couple things. It means that most folks can't afford access to legal services. But also another part of this, Hirsch, is that it leads to the alienation of different groups and neighborhoods and folks who don't have that representation to begin with. And I think these rules further kind of distance people from accessing the legal services and being part of that. And I think by rethinking the regulations in our space, what that should lead to is actually more work for legal professionals. And it should also lead to a place where anyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status, their mother tongue, what neighborhood they grew up, or any of the facts, can get access to high quality, affordable legal services. So that's what I've been really fighting hard for. And there's been just such a tremendous community in Canada and the United States and abroad of folks who are also pushing that forward as well.
Yeah, we had Justice Simonis on earlier in the summer talking about his sandbox, and you've been talking about regulation, and Chris and I have heard you talk many times about re-regulation. So you've done a lot of work in California with the State Bar Task Force charged with identifying regulatory change to bolster access to justice. Can you maybe talk about a little bit of the work that you've done with them and some of the outcomes that you hope are coming out of that?
Yeah, so for folks watching live as well as this recording, I think you might hear when people talk about legal re-regulation, unlocking regulation, or regulatory reform, I think what that really comes down to is asking the question of, does the system we currently have in place work? And it's obvious it doesn't. The statistics range anywhere between 80% of folks' legal needs go unmet. It's, if you think about when you talk to people and you say, hey, and you just have a conversation with folks and say, hey, is a lawyer expensive or affordable? Everyone always thinks they're expensive. You can't trust a lawyer. Why would I get involved? There's a whole bunch of negative feelings and vibes when it comes to the legal profession in general. And I think that's because it's seen as this thing that's inaccessible. And so I think when you think of unlocking regulations, regulatory reform, it's really saying, hey, why don't we consider other methods, other possible regulatory frameworks that might work? It doesn't mean anyone I would say, and I can't speak for the whole community, but when you think about regulatory reform, I don't think anyone's saying this way of doing things that I'm proposing is going to be 100% perfect. There's going to be the need to iterate. And that need to iterate and the need to examine different possibilities is what's given rise to this idea of the regulatory sandbox, which I'm sure a lot of folks have heard a lot about as well. Now, the regulatory sandbox is not a place where you can go in with a pail and a shovel. What it means is, an area that's roped off and a group of service providers, whether that's individuals or whether that's corporations or non-for-profits, runs the gambit, who can apply for access to deliver legal services in a manner that currently, with the current regulations in place, would not be allowed, but they would almost get that access to do so. When they enter into the sandbox, the data in terms of their performance will be collected. And then we're going to be able to say, hey, this worked, this didn't work. And so instead of going off of the idea of, hey, we can't change anything because it's going to affect negatively the public, which it might, we're able to have a sandbox which allows folks us to track that data. It's going to also allow anyone to make the free decision to say, hey, I'm going to use a provider within this sandbox. I understand the risks that I'm taking on, but this is something I want to do. And then hopefully the idea here, Hirsch, is that with the data that comes in through the sandbox model, we then can make more informed decisions around a regulatory framework that does work for as many people as possible, obviously with the goal to be as close to, if not 100%.
That's great. We just got a question on AI, and I was actually thinking about jumping there as well. Often when people talk about AI in the law, they see a picture of a robot lawyer and lots of lawyers taking away jobs. And I remember the first time I heard you speak very early on. Obviously, I don't think any of us are proposing that stuff. So, where do you see AI playing the biggest role in law? Where can it make a really big impact? And what do you think the future is for AI in law?
I think, and I certainly was guilty of this early on as well when I first heard artificial intelligence. I think growing up with movies like The Terminator or Judge Dredd or RoboCop, etc., led us to think that when you heard the terms artificial intelligence, there was some sort of a robot. But not only was there a robot, there must be some sinister element to the whole thing as well. And also that artificial intelligence is out for people's jobs, is kind of what also, it's just, it makes sense. I mean, it's what we saw growing up, and it's, those are the tales we got involved in terms of on the big screen. I think artificial intelligence, when you actually look under the hood, and this I think is why it actually might be more scary, even scarier rather, for the legal profession, because it's actually just advanced math. It's not really that much magic in terms of all of what it is, but what it can do is simplify processes that before were impossible to do with technology without having a huge amount of human inputs and a huge amount of kind of human effort, as well as just massive amounts of computing power that just wouldn't necessarily work in terms of response times to your query. So with the rise of the ability to have just raw computational power as of late, we've led to this place where we could start to train computer systems to identify patterns and to understand, if you're talking about natural language processing, human language, legalese included, and start to be able to streamline certain tasks for us. But Hirsch, artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, whatever you want to call it, the old joke is that once it starts working, what do you call it? Software. And in many ways, I think we're at a point where there was that big kind of push, AI, coming for your job, fear, et cetera. And I think we're getting over that. And I think we're starting to see the benefits of stuff that AI does. Let's talk about our normal lives. You talk about and you put on a music streaming site. And if you put it on random, it is using machine learning to identify, hey, Hirsch likes these types of songs. Maybe it might even get into the granularity of the rhythms you like, or the level of bass you like, or the treble. It can start to look at all these factors and start to suggest things for you. Now, would it make sense, Hirsch, for you to employ 10 to 15 people who are just like, eating, having those old school New York police, coffee cups, like stressing out, like, which song do we play for Hirsch next? No, that would be nuts. But that's kind of what gets automated. It doesn't mean, however, that the entire music industry and the selection is something that's going away. And as a matter of fact, the human curation of music oftentimes just sounds more appealing in some situations. But that level of personalization and finding things quickly is what I think is on the rise. Now, let's take it to law. I think a lot of what we do in law is extremely important, high-level, creative work. But I think there was also an element of doing things that were a lot more what some have labeled in law grunt work, or just kind of spending a bunch of hours trying to find the needle in the haystack. And whether that means you're doing legal research and trying to find case precedents that help you, statutes, regs, et cetera, or whether that might mean reviewing the same form of contract a million times and kicking out the same clauses. These are things that machine learning, NLP will be able to help with. Might not be able to do that perfectly, but humans don't do that perfectly. And I think it's the combination of that technology with the human power that you lead to the greatest results. And so I always say that AI is not going to replace lawyers. It's a ridiculous statement, but lawyers who know how to use technology tools, including those that are built using machine learning, natural language processing, those lawyers are going to be a lot more competitive than those who don't. So that's kind of the way I would think about it.
Data is at the heart of AI, access to data. And I mean, I don't know how much you can say. There was a lawsuit. I think there's been a lawsuit for a long time now with Thomson Reuters, and I know you guys filed against them. I think it was yesterday. I don't know how much you can comment on that. So I will throw it out there. And if you want to throw in some thoughts about that as I ask about data, I mean, data is at the heart of AI. And so access to as much data as possible is essential for building real successful systems. So why is it so difficult to get access to data in the States, in Canada, and elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I think it depends. I think I won't necessarily speak to that, the TR and Ross situation yet. Maybe I will later. But what I will say is this.
I'll keep poking.
Yeah. What I will say is this. I think data in law is something that we have a lot of, which is really great. And so if you think about, if you're trying to build a tool that does something like contract review, a lot of what you could do is build using past reviews of contracts, that have been redlined and back and forth, and the process and law of redlining, and even the way that we kind of have this tongue-in-cheek competition between opposing counsel, where we say, hey, that's not standard, this is standard, and there's that back and the forth, and we document everything as legal professionals, which is all great in terms of building out these AI systems. So I think depending on the task, you need different forms of data. I think for us in legal research, the data that you need is kind of the access to primary case law, statutes, regulations. Tough part there is, depending on what jurisdiction you are in the world, there is the ability to use it or not, or you have to seek out partnerships, which can be very expensive to gain it. So I think ultimately on that, I think if you're building out legal research tools, you can run into some of those issues. But ultimately, I think there's such a wide open market still untapped for ML, NLP, image recognition, for example, could play a major role in IP litigation, where depending on looking and searching through patents, if you could start searching with images. That's a free idea for folks out there, and I think at Ross we're pursuing some of that. But I'm happy to share that one into the ether. I think that's a really neat thing that we'll start to see in the future as well. So it really depends. What I guess to answer that simply, Hirsch, is sometimes the data can be a limiting factor, but I think most of the time, by the nature of how we've set things up and that we've documented things, I mean, large law firms are sitting on huge troves of this data that can be used to train ML software. And even smaller law firms with long storied histories have the same. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the future, I very rarely like to make predictions, because I think, it's always very difficult. I don't think anyone could have predicted how 2020 was going to go. I think there were murder hornets involved in it as well, or murder wasps. I don't know what they were called, but I do think in the future you might see law firms merge and come together, because say that one law firm specializes in maritime law, for example, that the history and their expertise can go into training a system. And it's not unlike what we see with senior partners when they, switch law firms. Hey, Hirsch is the best at dealing with anything to do with construction law when it comes to liens or this or that. It's going to be a similar thing to train these systems. And I think I'm not going to commit on a timeline to that, but I will say I think that's definitely in the cards in the future.
That's a great point. I never thought about the merging of law firms for their data. It's fantastic. You tweeted outside of the TR stuff yesterday. You also tweeted about the courts and access to the data in the courts, and came up with a few different ideas. I mean, Chris and I at the Legal Innovation Zone have always felt some frustration that getting information out of the courts, which should be public, is extremely difficult. What should the courts do? Are there other jurisdictions that do it better? Because I feel like that's a really great way to help build better systems in the future for access to justice and whatnot.
Yeah, and actually, I think I'm doing an interview later today for a piece that's going to be talking a little bit more about that. I think the access to judicial opinions and court data generally is something that should be fundamentally made available to everyone. I think of life sometimes. This past weekend, I was playing Monopoly, which is a really good way to alienate friends and family. But one of the things I started thinking about was, when you think of, there was a disagreement about free parking. Depending on who you're playing with, some folks think that free parking is where you pay luxury tax to, and other things on and other people believe that free parking should always have $500 in it. And then there's the purists, which do neither of those things, and it's just free parking. So I said, we got to check the rules. We got to look at the rules. And then I thought to myself, what if the rules were behind a paywall? And what if the rules weren't accessible? And what if the rules were being owned by, another interest that then you have to pay money to unnecessarily, when it should be made available so that you can understand what's going on in the game? And so I thought of that very similarly to what you see in terms of what's going on. I think in terms of where you see a lot of progress being made in the UK, I think the move to online courts there, I think, is going to be wonderful. And I do think, and maybe this bridges it. I know you mentioned COVID. I think this move to online digital courts is highlighting the need to have this occur. I also think there's generational differences. The other day I was dealing with something and it said, hey, you can email this in or you can fax it in. And I remember thinking to myself, like, who's faxing? And I know that at my law firm, we faxed a lot. So I guess my point is that there's the rush to digitize, I think, with what's happening with COVID is certainly something that I think will lead to more digitization and more openness to having that data. I think data is essential to benchmarking the success of our judicial system as well. And I think we need to understand how many pro se litigants are bringing forward landlord tenant issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so we can benchmark and then improve on those numbers year after year. And I think we're dealing with something that is the fabric of democracy when it comes to your ability to have insight into these decisions in court data. And I think, luckily, I think there's a ton of progress. And I think culturally right now across the world is this move that is questioning why things are the way they are and questioning corporate interests in the way things are and questioning perhaps a bit of kind of something that's not even sinister. It's just a matter of people are doing things because that's the way we always did things. So I think that's being questioned right now.
Yeah. So I was just about to get into the COVID and legal tech and all that fun stuff, but I just got a question about regulation. So before we get too far away from the conversation on regulation, I'm going to throw it in here. And I guess the question is, what has been your experience when trying to speak to regulators about re-regulation? What is the top 1, 2, 3 pushbacks that always the, let's call it more conservative group, go and fight against?
I don't know if you hit me on a day that I had extra sleep or if I had an extra great breakfast, but I'm feeling very hopeful today. So here's what I would say. The number one complaint that I get when I'm pushing forward with the groups that I'm very happy and lucky to be part of around unlocking regulations, and whether that I work with a group called ILS, the Institute for the Advancement of the American Legal System. I've been doing some great work with them, and with the Cal Bar and others. Number one is, hey, we need to protect the public. And that is coming from a very genuine, real place of concern. That is coming from, hey, I am scared that by changing the rules, it's going to result in worse outcomes for the general public than what is currently being offered. And I think when you put your hat on, and we're going to talk about entrepreneurship and legal tech, but this is linked. When you are trying to change the way people do things or think of things, that when you get below a lot of the anger and sometimes people could be rude or mean to you, really underlying that is fear. And that is a very powerful emotion. And I think the fear here is that what's going to happen, and the unknown in law is something that is a very difficult concept, because even if the way that we work as lawyers, we seek precedent, we look to the past to inform the future. But if there is no precedent on changing the regulatory framework, it's like, well, what are we going to do? We can't do that. And so I would say that is, this might be a cheap trick, Hirsch. That's number 1, 2, and 3. Because what that means, though, it doesn't mean that is a great thing it's very difficult to overcome. And so what you have to do is, and what I think has been such an effective part of the Sandbox model, is to say, hey, I hear that, and I agree with you about that. What are some ways that we can work together to try to benchmark some of these new ways of looking at things so that we can avoid damage to the public? Now, here's the other thing is critical here. We have to set reasonable expectations. The benchmark of a sandbox versus, the status quo should not be what that person gets if they have a paid, high-quality lawyer as their representative. You have to benchmark against the reality, and the reality is zero legal representation.
That's right.
And I think that is, I guess, to add number 2, that when we get to that part of the conversation, it gets a bit problematic, because people will argue, no, you have to benchmark it against what would the outcome be if they have a lawyer, but that is not what's happening. Now, if you benchmark to what happens if someone doesn't have a lawyer, it really changes the dynamic completely. And I do think the other day there was an article that came out, and I forget the source, but it said something along the lines of like, people need to have a qualified lawyer. And there was some really horrible language when it came to describing so-called non-lawyers. And I think that that is the leftovers of some of the cultural problems we have in law, which is rooted in elitism. And it's rooted in this idea of knowing better than anyone else. And it's rooted in, and some of that is necessary in the sense that we have to be confident that we are trying to protect the public. But I think that comes at a cost at times, where our elitism is actually eroding the public trust in our judicial system, and it is alienating various groups who, for socioeconomic reasons and systemic racism problems, have not been able to access the legal system. And when we all have to take a seat and take a step back as to what are the lens that I'm wearing right now when I'm attacking a problem. And when people talk about diversity in law, I think people miss the point. The reason why you need diversity in problem solving is because it results in better outcomes. It's not just morally what you need to do and it's ethically what needs to be done, but it's actually what's best for problem solving. Because we all step into a problem with lenses on. And when some of them are caught, we're aware of it, and some of it we're not. And when you look at it and we're wearing the old lenses of our profession, it has resulted in the problems we now face. And we now need to use different mechanisms and think outside the box to solve them. And that doesn't mean a world with zero lawyers. And it doesn't mean a world with only lawyers delivering legal services. It's somewhere in between, and we need to figure that out.
And Ross Intelligence, is founded by first generation Canadians. You are a very diverse group. So how do we get more diversity, both in law and in entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to growing up, Hirsch. I didn't know and understand that you could be an entrepreneur in the sense that I am now. Gmo, my co-founder, is Black. I am brown. I think that the neighborhoods that we grew up in, the circumstances and the lenses that we had were lenses which saw the world in a certain way. And we didn't necessarily run in the same circles as other individuals. I can only speak for myself on this, and it just wasn't even a consideration. And I remember talking to kids from my old neighborhood and asking them how much they think university costs a year. And I think some of the answers range from $20,000 to $100,000 a year. They just didn't understand or grasp what's going on. And I think part of why I get so passionate about legal regulatory reform is because I also think that will give rise to entrepreneurship within our profession, because it will start to involve communities and people from various backgrounds in this problem-solving methodology that will be created in the new way of delivering legal services. So how do we reach out? I think this is an age-old question. If I had the answer to this, I think I could help solve a lot of problems and maybe retire young, but I think that's not going to happen. But I think one of the things is people need to see others like them involved in something so that they know it's possible. And I think we can't underestimate the importance of that. And you've seen that. I mean, sometimes I like to use, even just in music, you see Justin Bieber, Canadian, become a really big deal. That not only made a whole bunch of Canadian musicians think to themselves, I could really make it huge. It also led to a bunch of the folks who are in the decision-making in music making, hit makers, the money behind music, say, hey, you know what? Let's fund some other Canadian artists here. There's a hit, and then you get Drake, and then you get The Weeknd, and then you get, a whole bunch of other artists that are springing up across the board. Now, these artists, these people who are so talented, who then make up the soundtrack of, the 2000s in our lives, were individuals who might be working in a totally different field because their dream wouldn't have been realized because they wouldn't either have pursued it or people wouldn't have taken a chance on them. And so I see a ton of wasted potential in legal, in startups, in entrepreneurship by our failure at times to identify the fact that we need to do more in terms of improving diversity in almost every field or walk. And so I often think for myself, like if I didn't, there was a set of circumstances that led to me meeting and seeing a lawyer from my community who used to do a radio show, and then me thinking, hey, I actually can do this. And then I ended up, working and getting a job there. And then that led me to understand law, and that led me to believe in myself and this whole kind of way that I got here. So I think the best way to do it is just to I love the fact that right now as a society, we're pressing pause and trying to understand what lenses we're wearing as a society, as individuals, and critically working through it. It's a really tough time right now, but it's also a time that I think leaves me very hopeful.
You mentioned Bieber to Drake to The Weeknd, and you are actually one of those people because in North America really, but 3 of these companies are all Canadian. We have Ross Intelligence, we have our good friends at Clio, and we've got our good friends at Kira, who are all superstars in the legal tech world in different areas. And I think because of your success and Clio's success and Kira's, and hopefully maybe a little bit of the legal innovation zones, legal tech, from our point of view, has really been taking off over the last 5-6 years. And so I guess my question here is, some have been great, but a lot of legal tech, it's very difficult to break into law firms, break into governments, break into access to justice areas. What's really holding, has it been getting easier for you? And again, we've got this lawsuit, so probably isn't, but what's the path for legal tech entrepreneurship? Is it easier? How can we make it easier?
Yeah, well, I don't want to come across as cheesy, but I think part of what made the Ross story truly crystallize in us, Jimo and I, and then the team, and us continue to just keep moving forward was shortly after Jimo had the idea for Ross, he contacts me, I join him, and I think maybe a week or two, maybe it could have been a month. So I don't quote me on the exact time here. We ended up going to a conference being hosted in Toronto at Mars, where a bunch of legal tech people from not only across Canada, across the United States were there. And it made it seem totally normal to be pursuing a dream to build a legal tech company and to, care about access to justice and care about scaling and becoming a multi-billion-dollar company and care about these things. And the fact that that community existed in Toronto in the way it did, and I know that I ended up meeting folks from Clio there, and I ended up, from Kira, and talking to people, and I was like, oh, so this is something that I can pursue, and this is real. And, so, I think what you're seeing a little bit with legal tech too is legal tech suffers at times from suffering from the sins of our parents. And what I mean by that is legal tech sometimes has borrowed some of the cultural elements you see in law. And one of them that I think it has borrowed heavily from is the fear of messing up, or the fear of failure. And sometimes I think even as a community, we almost chastise if someone has a bad release, or if this tool doesn't work out, and what this funding went there, and someone should have gotten that funding. And meanwhile, what we have to realize is that innovation comes through mostly failure. You have to fail a bunch of times to find out what works. And I think we need to remove that element. If there's one thing that I could say, Hirsch, I think we've done a wonderful job in getting people excited about it. But the reality is, for the entrepreneurs that strap on the astronaut suits and then go out to do it, I think sometimes I've heard, especially from younger, startup folks in the space, hey, Andrew, I'm really scared because, what if this doesn't work out? And I say, hey, if it doesn't work out, you're going to learn a lot more doing this than you're going to do anything. But hey, what are the folks, going to say in the community on Twitter or this or that? And I'm like, look, at the end of the day, there's a difference between someone taking the risk to try to make a difference and to actually build something, which is very difficult, and someone who's on the sidelines and criticizing it. And I think that criticism, use it and see, and not all criticism is bad. Maybe your tool isn't great, and maybe that wasn't a great launch, but then use it and build it. And so I think that suffering from some of the sins of the larger community is something that I think we could do to kind of get us to the next level. I spoke in Singapore. They have a fabulous community there. And I spoke at an event there that was unbelievable. And I talked about how if we are going to really push through and break through as a legal tech community. We just have to now start believing in ourselves a bit more and looking at things like fintech and health tech and other areas and say, hey, you know, what are the good things from those communities and what are the bad? But one of them is we do have to get over and encourage some failures, some scrapes and bruises, and be okay with that. And I think with Ross, we were one of the first to kind of start doing things like release early on something and then iterate. And then some folks, you know, thought, hey, you know, this could have been improved this way or that way. And we did. And so it's just interesting. It's been really wonderful though to see over the past 5 or so years, the maturity in our field. And I think Clio, for example, has been just so wonderful. And then we had Jack Noon join our board, which was just lovely. Like it's a very warm, strong community worldwide. And so there's, I don't know, in terms of improvements, I think just shoring up and letting folks know you can get some scrapes and bruises, and you will. I don't think, if you think about all, you know, the greatest athletes, the greatest musicians, the greatest authors, the greatest scientists, science is about, you know, testing your hypothesis and it failing. It's not like you figure out penicillin on your first go. And if you do, you know, that might be more of a fluke than actually a sign of your capability.
I think we all wish they got that COVID vaccine on the first go, but
we're all hoping.
Yeah. So with COVID, I mean, COVID, many people who are very active in legal tech and legal innovation say COVID may have sped up this market. You know, what we thought may have been possible 5 or 10 years out, or law firms are starting to believe in now. What effect have you seen COVID have on legal tech?
Well, I'll say this. I wade into this question very hesitantly because, first of all, my partner is a pulmonary ICU doctor, and she, you know, I've seen firsthand and hear firsthand about the effects of what COVID has on the human body and their families, and it is extremely difficult. I think that with that said, I think, you know, you can't help but see and look and hear and talk about as a community what this means in terms of legal technology moving forward. And I think it's unfortunate that we've had to have a pandemic highlight in society some of the systemic issues we've had around race, as around healthcare, but also I think now in terms of cultural change in law to technology. I don't understand how before we couldn't use, you know, something like an electronic signature, but all of a sudden now we can. And I don't understand how we couldn't use video in courtroom, but all of a sudden now we can. And so while I am extremely happy about the fact that we've sped up the digitization in legal by quite a lot through this, it's unfortunate that that change came through a negative kind of kickoff point rather than folks opting into it. That being said, what am I hearing, Hirsch? I mean, I mentor I've mentored some startups that are just at the same size as Ross or getting bigger now, which is lovely in our space and just in other spaces as well. And I think what you're seeing is there is 100% an increase depending on where you are and what you're doing in purchasing with some, but there are also some bad losses within legal technology as well. If you were focusing on a technology that really centered around humans going into court, for example, and some of the things that are not happening anymore, you're seeing some roadblocks there. So I think as a whole, I'm seeing advancement, but I think I also am cautiously optimistic because I want to see what happens when things go back. I don't think things will go back to normal as they were once before, but I really want to see what this means because it's going to be hard to argue you can't use Zoom for certain routine kind of court appearances or accept a digital signature. But we'll see. I think you never know. I've seen everything in this in legal, and so I'm cautiously optimistic.
Do you have any I know there's a bunch of entrepreneurs on the phone right now. Do you have any advice on best practices on breaking into a law firm? You know, we always hear selling into law firms is very tough.
Yeah, it is very tough. I guess what I would say is one of the biggest challenges you'll find in legal tech is especially getting into the larger the law firm, the harder it is because there are multiple decision makers and you have to it's almost like you need all the stars to align. So not only do you need a great product, not only does it have to solve the problem that you say it solves at the time that it's being assessed and demoed, then you have to ensure that the decision makers at those firms both understand the problem, can confirm that the tool solves that problem, and then that they want to purchase it. And then you have to ensure that they have budget. And then on top of that, you have to ensure the timing of that works out. So what I would suggest is there's a definite huge opportunity. What I would suggest is make sure at the early stages, you tell your investors that you're going to have long sales cycles up front, so that when you do raise, maybe don't spend too much up front. Really focus in on building that product and solving that problem. I think one thing that really helped us is we built alongside a group of law firms very early on, who then committed to purchase the product, Ross, depending on us hitting certain benchmarks. So that served as that first initial wave to then kind of half fund us as well, in addition to our venture capital funding. And I also think the other thing is that it can become discouraging. And I think it's a very emotional path as an entrepreneur in any industry. I mean, I split my time between San Francisco and Toronto and the tech communities in both. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in. Being an entrepreneur is extremely difficult. But I think it's particularly tough with legal because you're also doing a little bit of the R&D work and education that either would have to be split between law schools and law firms. And so there's a lot of kind of difficulty. That being said, it's like a big moat to get over. But if you do get to the other side, your tool is something that then is very sticky. People take to it. And some of the most amazing customers in the world have been the large law firms, small law firms, and everything in between. One thing we did as a company that I think has been highly effective is then really launch to address both sides of the market. So we can do, the long drawn out 6 months, conversation, negotiation, then get, the 6-figure deal. Or, you can hop onto Ross, and this is not me doing a sales pitch, this is me telling the entrepreneurs of it, or you can hop onto our website without entering a credit card, try our product for 14 days, commitment free, and if it delivers value, you can purchase it. So that captures both small law firms, but it also captures the lawyers and decision makers at large law firms who might want to cut through some of the red tape they have at their firm and try out the product and then, say, hey, I already tried this, here it is, this is what I think about it. So it's been very helpful in that regard.
You mentioned if you get over the moat, it could be great. We've seen also some companies that get over the moat deal with one or two issues. One is the legal services regulation. Regulators start coming after you because they say that you're offering legal advice. And the other one is sometimes you become quite successful, possibly a company named Ross, and bigger companies start to come after you, such as TR. So how do you, if you want to use your example, how do you avoid those types of pitfalls?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Sometimes through your success, you get some competitors who are upset, and that's fine. I think to address Ross and TR head on, I think I'm gonna just say something very clear. We did not copy any of the alleged copyrighted material. We had absolutely no use for that material, and so that's just the way it is. As it pertains to what you do, I think that is, you're going to hit these roadblocks no matter what industry you're in. Now speaking, this is separate and aside from any comments as to the litigation. I'm just talking about growing large and becoming and elbowing up against competitors. I think that's going to be natural. I think at the end of the day, growing up as a company comes with a lot of different challenges. And sometimes that also means just coming up against the old way that things were always done. And, it's just about I think ultimately your customers is who you need to focus on. And ultimately, if you build your company in a way that with too much of thinking about your competitors, it's not the right way to do that. And this is like general advice, whether you're in legal tech or not, but particularly in legal tech. I think ultimately, you need to focus on your customers, deliver the most value you can with the software you're building, and then also continue to iterate and keep going back and saying something like, hey, how could this get better? Are you getting the value that you want from our product? And one way we do that is we do something by tracking something called the Net Promoter Score. And if for entrepreneurs out there watching this, check it out. it is a highly effective way of just being able to at a glance say, hey, you're asking your customers, how likely are you to recommend this tool to a peer, or basically translating how happy on a scale of 1 to 10 are you with the tool. And then you track that, and you kind of subtract detractors from promoters. And there has been a direct correlation between our NPS score going up and our growth, doubling, tripling, and then staying consistently high, and our churn remaining really low. So I think that has been all things and levers you can look to.
On the topic of focusing on consumers and always moving forward, what is Ross up to these days? What's coming out? What just came out? What new products do you have? And also on top of that, you've got a fantastic AI office in Toronto. What is exciting there?
We have something that we're developing that I'll hope to demo to you and Chris soon. I think Gmo and the team will literally probably jump through a camera and kill me. But it is really, really awesome. It is something that we've all had to do that we hated doing, and it took a very long time. And we figured out a way using the tech that we already built with Ross, how to combine a few things together to get a task done. So watch out for that. And then I think it's been wonderful to have the team and to be split between the Toronto ecosystem where we build and have all our product folks, and then to have the presence in the US, both on a sales marketing side, has been really wonderful. And I think, it allows us to both get the pulse from where things are being built and where, things, we still have our feet in Silicon Valley, but I think the Toronto ecosystem is just world leading, I think, both from an ML perspective, but just in general. And I think, last year, I think the statistic was that Toronto added more tech jobs than Silicon Valley and New York combined. So it has been a wonderful thing. And I think in some ways, the Legal Innovation Zone and Ross, our stories are very much tied together. I remember showing up at your office when the furniture was just, there was not too much furniture. I know, it's hard for people to even find a place to set down a laptop. And I think the same can go and be said about Toronto in general. The Toronto tech ecosystem is booming. I think we've been able to have such strong partnerships with wonderful organizations. And it's been so lovely. I think the support we've had in Toronto has been wonderful. And I think the reception in the United States is wonderful. And I would say watch out for potential movement on the Canadian front. I know that it's something that every time we end up chatting, it's something that we refer to. But there might be something on the horizon that is actually a lot sooner than a lot of folks think.
We are excited to see it. I think we have time for one last question, and I know there was so much more that we had wanted to talk about, but I think I'm going to focus again with Ryerson's about to open up a new law school, and you talk at law schools all over the world, really. We've spoken about Spain. I know you're very involved with the University of Saskatchewan. We actually, I think in October, we're planning on going up to Nunavut.
Oh wow! Yeah, that trip that we've been planning that is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So COVID's gone into a lot of our plans, but I mean, the future of the profession is so important. What advice would you have for a lot of the young lawyers that are on this call right now and are going to be watching it in the future in terms of what should they be focused on? What does the future hold for them?
So I think I would say the future is bright if you can get a bit uncomfortable and work through some of the, trough of, disillusionment that might come when you're trying to rethink and do things in a different way. And so I'm not going to say it's rosy in that pushing through and trying to do things differently results in everyone opening up their arms and saying, oh gosh, you're so right. I never thought of it that way. You are going to face challenges. But what I would say is we are now at a time where, especially what's happening in 2020, people are realizing the way we've done things to date might not be the best way to continue to do things moving forward. And I think whereas, especially in the legal profession, associate, senior associate, partner, senior partner, this, that, and very hierarchical. But I think you can kind of skip ahead a lot of steps if you are thinking outside the box and you're thinking to yourself, how can technology help shape practice? How can potentially using creative marketing help this? And how can fighting for regulatory reform help me as well? One thing that people forget about the regulatory reform arguments that are occurring across the globe right now is that they're also arguing for the relaxation of rules around things like marketing, things like being able to share your fees with other with other non-legal professionals. You have to ask yourself why, Ross was founded by computer science and law together, which makes total sense. Now, why can't there be a law firm where a social worker works with a lawyer, works with an engineer, works with an MBA to deliver a complete package and service? Makes total sense.
That's crazy.
So, yes. And so I think that we need to think of the opportunity that comes with pushing this idea of changing the way things are being done from a regulatory standpoint. And I think that if I was a young lawyer, I would get involved in those conversations because I think the beautiful thing about legal tech is that you can do the right thing in terms of improving access to justice. You can make a great life for yourself, and you can have a tangible effect on how legal services are delivered for future generations in the world. To me, that's the most exciting thing you could ever say. Like, I just said that, and I'm like, I'm going to jump out of my chair, and that's what I want to do. And I think that in other fields that might have gone through these revolutions before, I think there's still much more improvement to be made, but you could really be a leader in something that is not only a great way to make a living, financially, you could, really great for your family and future generations, but that actually puts some good into the world and that actually helps change legal outcomes for Canadians, Americans, and everyone around the world. Sometimes people forget this. Hey, Andrew, you were on the California State Bar, ATILS group, you're Canadian. What happens in California happens in Ontario. What happens in Quebec happens in, England. We are now operating within a global economy and a world that looks to all the different jurisdictions as to what's happening. And on that note, I just want to, if I can kind of, ring a bell, Utah has been doing some wonderful things, but they have a public commentary right now is open for you to be able to get involved and start to write in and say, what you're thinking about the regulatory reform there. I have a blog post that's going to come out on I'll tweet it, but it ends on July 23rd. So we still have some time. Get involved, send a letter, and be part of it, not only because you can make a great living out of what's the future of legal services delivery, but because it's the right thing to do. And for me, I think of when my grandparents were immigrants, my parents are immigrants, and the reverence they had for the experience in Canada when it came to democracy and the ability to actually, there was this idea, the harder you work, the more you can make, and the ability to be an upstanding good person and the importance of that. And I think that you can do that when it comes to legal tech in ways that is really beautiful. So I would just encourage you to think about it as a profession. It's not going to be easy, especially up front. And so, you don't just rush out and everyone just says, yeah, you're right. But there's tremendous opportunity. And I think the future is still extremely bright, if not brighter. I think the challenges in society are very real, and we owe it to ourselves to help solve them and to each other. And there's a lot of opportunity.
Well, I think that is a fantastic note to finish off our Legal Gold Rush series. And obviously I couldn't picture a better person to have on our last session than you. So I'm going to hand it off to Chris, but thank you so much as always for joining us. Chris?
Thanks, Hirsch. That was fantastic. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to share. You are a true leader. Leader, not only in technology, not only in law and the re-regulation, but your message to lawyers everywhere, in particular those who are much younger than me. They can make a life, they can make a living, and make a difference. What a powerful way to inspire people. Thank you so much. Thanks, Hirsch, for the conversation with Andrew. To all who joined us, thank you. You can find this recording to hear it again or share it with friends on the Legal Innovation Zone website. This is the final installment of our Gold Rush series, but we have some more coming down the pipe. Stay safe, be well, take care.